Good day. Those of you who have been following my channel will know that I have been skeptical pretty much from the outset that the assemblages of forces by Ukraine on the ceasefire line with the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, or that the Russian counter moves, assembling very much larger forces on the Ukrainian border and in Crimea. I have always doubted that these two assemblages of forces would result in war. As I have repeatedly said, in such a war, Ukraine would be comprehensively defeated. There have been some attempts, there's an interesting article to that effect in the Financial Times, to try to claim that the Ukrainian military is in better shape today than it was in 2014. I suspect that that is true, but those kind of reports overlook the fact that since 2014, the Russian army has advanced also by leaps and bounds. Moreover, I suspect and believe that the development of the Russian army since 2014 has been much faster and stronger than that of the Ukrainian army has been, notwithstanding all the weapons that Ukraine has received from countries like the United States. So the military balance in Ukraine, or at least in this region, has actually continued to shift against Ukraine. And that would have meant that a war in Ukraine this summer would have resulted in a rapid Ukrainian defeat and the complete destruction of the Ukrainian military and quite possibly the end of Ukraine itself as a state. At least that's what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said. So it seemed to me most unlikely that a war would happen. I've always found it difficult to believe that Ukraine would launch a war in circumstances which it was certain to lose and where it might face its own destruction. It seemed to me all but inconceivable that the Western powers, who have ruled out intervening in such a war, would want to embrace the humiliation of a Ukrainian defeat, and I thought that they would do everything within their power to dissuade Ukraine from launching such an offensive. And it seemed to me also unlikely that the Russians, for their part, would want a war at this time. They've always said that they have no interest or wish to start a war against Ukraine, that their response would always be reactive, that they would respond to an attack by the Ukrainians on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, but that they would not initiate such a war. As it happens, I think the Russians have another reason for not wanting a war to take place at this time. Briefly, with every passing day, the balance of advantage tilts ever further in their favor. As I have said, their military becomes stronger, faster, and in greater depth, far greater depth than Ukraine's military gets stronger. Their economy is vaster and it's growing stronger, whereas Ukraine's economy is declining and stagnating, and support for Ukraine in the West is gradually faltering. Ukraine was, I suspect, dismayed by the fact that its repeated calls for more arms supplies, for dispatch of Patriot missile systems to deter Russia, for fast-tracking of its memberships of NATO and of the European Union, all faced a brush-off from its Western allies. I suspect that the Ukrainians also were less than happy about the fact that all their erstwhile European and American friends were telling them that the only solution to the conflict in Ukraine is via the full implementation of the Minsk agreement, which requires Ukraine to negotiate directly with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which is something that Ukraine has consistently refused to do. It was a striking fact that even the United States, in its various recent statements, has started to talk about the need for the full implementation of the Minsk agreement, given that up to now, the United States has always been wary of giving the Minsk agreement its full-throated endorsement. So the balance of advantage is gradually shifting against Ukraine. The Russians know it, and from their point of view, there is little purpose or point in starting a war in eastern Ukraine now, when that balance of advantage is going to tilt even further in their favor over the next few years. Bear in mind that without such a war, it is likely that Nord Stream 2 will be completed this year, eventually depriving Ukraine of $3 billion of transit fees, and that the Russian rearmament program, which is in full swing, will eventually be completed, probably within the next few years, and that, of course, the Russians will have completed even further the development of their own financial system, that they will have persuaded more countries to accept the Mir payment card, and that next year also they're launching the digital ruble, which will eventually enable them to circumvent whatever cut off from SWIFT the Europeans and the Americans threaten. So from a Russian point of view, playing a long game works to their advantage. It always has. It's always done so ever since 2014. And that is a compelling reason, it has seemed to me, why the Russians would not actually embrace a war now. So, given that it was in no one's real interests to begin a war, it seemed to me most unlikely that a war would happen. The only circumstance where there might have been a war would have been if Ukraine had seriously thought that if it launched an offensive against the two People's Republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Russia would not come to their rescue, allowing Ukraine eventually to reconquer them. I think there may have been some people in Kiev who thought that was a possibility, and it's quite likely that there were some people in Washington who thought that was a possibility also. I've discussed in my various programs how it is beginning to look to me as if certain concerted moves were being planned for this spring and early summer, with the deployment of Ukrainian forces to the contact line, with the movement of US and British warships to the Black Sea, with a coup apparently being planned in Belarus, a topic I shall come to in a future video. All of this looks as if it was being coordinated and was intended to happen at the same time as part of some great drive to attack and reconquer the Donbass in short order. Well, it's now absolutely clear as crystal that an attack on the Donbass is going to provoke a massive Russian counterstrike. If anybody believed in February and early March that the Russians would be deterred from doing it, they can be under no illusions now that such a counterstrike would indeed happen. That was the purpose of all that massive deployment of Russian troops, and as I have also pointed out in various programs I have done for this channel, strong statements made by various Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Lavrov and indeed President Putin himself, have made it absolutely clear that in the event of a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass, Russia would respond, and would respond militarily with overwhelming force. And it has become increasingly clear, and this is something which I have also been discussing in various programs on this channel, that the Ukrainians have gradually got the message from a position where they seem to be engaging in ever more belligerent rhetoric as their armies began to transfer east. They switched suddenly to panic and talk about the need for a ceasefire and calls for the West to help them in the event of what they called Russian aggression. And what panicked the Ukrainians also panicked the Western powers too. We've seen calls to President Putin from President Biden of the United States, from President Macron of France, from Angela Merkel of Germany. All of them apparently looking for a de-escalation of the situation in Ukraine. And I think we have now reached that point where we can say with some confidence that a war in eastern Ukraine this spring and summer is now most unlikely to take place. In fact, Zelensky has now recently taken to talking about the need for a summit meeting between himself and Putin in order to resolve all issues, and he's suggested that it should happen in the Donbass. And I gather that at the start of this week, there were also substantive discussions which apparently were successful up to a certain point, all with a view to trying to re-establish the ceasefire along the contact line. So, in light of this, and entirely unsurprisingly, the Russians have stood down their forces. Now, I say unsurprisingly because, as I have been repeatedly saying on these programs, the drift of events clearly pointed in that direction. This is not a Russian move to stand down Russia's forces in response to the firm stand the West was taking against the threats Russia was making against Ukraine. It is a Russian response to the fact that it has now become increasingly clear that whatever plan there may have been for a Ukrainian offensive in the Donbass has now been fully called off. Now, I'm going to read the statement that has appeared on the Russian Defense Ministry's website, which discusses the form of the standoff. And I'm going to discuss this in a little detail because it's not quite as radical as I think some people say. Now, it says the following. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, General of the Army Sergei Shoigu, decided to complete a sudden check of the combat readiness of the troops of the southern and western military districts, since all the goals set have been achieved. I believe that the goals of the surprise inspection have been fully achieved. The troops demonstrated the ability to provide a reliable defense of the country. In this regard, I have decided to complete the check activities in the southern and western military districts. The Ministry of Defense set the task to the General Staff, the commanders of the military districts, and the airborne troops to plan and begin on April 23rd to return the troops to the permanent deployment points, to conduct a detailed analysis, and to sum up the results of the sudden check. Sergei Shoigu also ordered to return to the places of permanent deployment of the troops that were involved in the exercises in the south of Russia until May 1st. The Minister of Defense ordered to encourage all distinguished servicemen during the exercises and training. So, it's a stand down, but note that it is not a retreat or a withdrawal. In effect, what Shoigu is saying is that they've carried out their rehearsals of a potential counterstrike. They've now worked out how it's going to be done, and that the result is that they don't need to have their forces on the border to the same extent anymore. They're going to move them back to their original, to their permanent bases, but of course, they're in a position to move them, to return them to the Ukrainian border at any time. In addition, it's important to say that the seas of Azov and the Kerch Strait continue to be closed to the warships of other countries. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of these military drills was the fact that the Russians also practiced large-scale amphibious assaults by the naval forces and the Marines that they have established on the Black Sea. Now, I am not a military man, but I am guessing that that means that in the event of a war in Ukraine, they would be making a naval landing on parts of the Ukrainian coast, presumably in the rear of the Ukrainian forces. And that is presumably one reason why they were so careful to say that US Navy warships and British Navy warships, for their own health, stay far away from the Russian coastline. So it looks increasingly as if the fever point of this crisis is over. The Russians have made their point. They will defend the two Donbass republics. They have the force and the will to do it, and they've now rehearsed how they will do it. They got all their plans ready, and as Shoigu said, they are now going to conduct a detailed analysis and will sum up the results of the sudden check, which is a way of saying that they will check out how their plans work in light of the exercises, or if you prefer, rehearsals, which they have engaged in, and that will put them in a position to launch this offensive if they need to. So it looks to me as if, for the moment at least, the war in the Donbass has been averted. In my previous program discussing this, I said that there were factors that perhaps argued for a war in future, but I have never thought that it would take place, at least I have never seriously thought it would take place this summer, though of course with the unpredictable nature of the government of Ukraine, one could never be entirely sure. Now, diplomatic activity will continue. The Russians will continue to press, and they made it very clear that they are now insisting upon it, that negotiations must now proceed on the basis of the Minsk agreements, which means direct negotiations between Ukraine and the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And we had striking confirmation from this from no less a person than President Putin himself over the course of a meeting he had in Moscow with President Lukashenko of Belarus on April 22nd, 2021. And this is what he said. This is what Putin said in response to a question about whether he would be prepared to agree to President Zelensky's proposal for a bilateral summit between himself and Zelensky to be held in the Donbass, that is to say on Ukrainian territory. This is what Putin said. As for the proposal of the Ukrainian leadership and President Zelensky, I would like to say the following. As of late, the current Ukrainian leadership took many steps that are destroying Russian-Ukrainian relations. This applies directly to a number of problems in bilateral relations. It includes their attitude towards the Russian Orthodox Church and attempts to destroy it. This applies to their attitude towards the Russian language and Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine and Russian citizens living in Ukraine. Many steps have been taken to destroy our relations, which we can only regret. However, if President Zelensky wants to start restoring these relations, we will only welcome this. A question suggests itself. What would we discuss at this meeting which he is proposing? If the discussion concerns the problems of Donbass, the Ukrainian leaders must, first of all, meet with the heads of the republics, the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, and then review the problems with representatives of third countries, that is, Russia in this case. This is the first point. Now, the second point. If the matter concerns the development of bilateral relations, this is fine. We will receive the president of Ukraine in Moscow anytime at his convenience. In other words, Putin says that he's not going to meet Zelensky in the Donbass. He is not prepared to discuss the Donbass and the settlement of the situation in eastern Ukraine with Zelensky. If Zelensky wants to settle the problem of eastern Ukraine, he must do that which Ukraine committed itself to do in the Minsk agreement, which is negotiate directly with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. If Zelensky, however, wants a summit with Putin to discuss bilateral relations between Russia and Ukraine, issues like economic cooperation and the rest, then the right venue for that is not the Donbass, but Moscow. Needless to say, Zelensky at the moment is going to find it very difficult to accept that proposal. But here we see very clearly, in Putin's words, the Russian precondition for a final settlement of this conflict and for a real conclusive withdrawal of Russian troops from the Ukrainian border, clearly and fully spelt out. The Ukrainian leaders must, first of all, meet with the heads of the republics, the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. There is no other way of resolving this problem, and the Russians have made that, and Putin has made that crystal clear. Thank you for joining me on this program, on this channel. Please also check out our other channel, our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. Please also check out our various other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also, to the extent that you can, support us via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And please remember that we accept donations in all currencies, including the new currencies, the new electronic currencies which have recently been appearing. And please also remember to check out our Discourse server and, of course, our shop and see the wonderful things we have there, our famous magic mugs, our T-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, and our hats. And thank you for joining me on this program, and I look forward to seeing you in future programs on this channel, and have a wonderful day until then.